Vanakkam everyone. Let's talk about Kubernetes namespace. One of the Kubernetes API resources would be a namespace, very similar to pod, deployment, servers, replica set, persistent volume claim, and all those. So we have around 55 API resources in Kubernetes, 55 plus I would say. So namespace is one among them. Technically speaking, namespace means virtual cluster, that is sharing the Kubernetes cluster. When multiple teams are looking for an access on the Kubernetes cluster, what we can do is we can create individual namespaces and give it to the respective team. And when we create the namespace, we also have to make sure that we set the resource quota and limit ranges. So we'll be talking about all these things in this particular session. So this is a Kubernetes cluster wherein you can see that we have a control plane and we have a couple of worker nodes, worker node 1 and worker node 2. In real time, I can even have 4 worker nodes, 10 worker nodes, 20 worker nodes, or more than that. Based on the applications and the utilization, I can create n number of worker nodes. So here, assume that we have 3 different teams, QA team, development team and production team, and they are looking for access to this particular Kubernetes cluster so that they can create and deploy their applications. So how do I do that? That is where the namespace comes into the picture. So we can relate this to a flat system, right? I mean, what I have done here is I have a flat 1 and flat 2, means I have isolated both the families so that each and every family can have their own space. For instance, flat 2 can have they can create the wall they can paint the wall with blue color. They can have their own 55-inch of TV, colorful sofas and all these things. And flat 1 they can have their own probably old-fashioned way of setup in their house, which will not disturb the flat 2. So it's all about isolation and having their own space. At the same time, we also make sure that we have the quota limit being set for the water consumption. For an example, I'll say that flat 1 can consume 200 liters of water. That is the quota limit being set. Flat 2 can have 500 liters of water limit per month, so that the utilization of the water is being managed properly. Similar way with respect to namespace as well. That is, as you can see, I have one single cluster, so I have divided into 3, means I am creating 3 different namespaces. And I can give any name for the namespace. In this case, I'm giving the namespace name as QA Dev Monitoring. It's not that I have to divide a namespace and give it to a team alone. A namespace can be allocated for certain categories of applications as well. In this case, it is monitoring, right? For an example, I'm saying that I am allocating a namespace specifically to deploy all sort of monitoring and logging related applications. So whenever there is an issue with respect to monitoring or logging, I can just tell my admin that, hey, just go and look into the monitoring namespace. Seems like we have an application issues in that. The alertings are not getting triggered properly. The developers are unable to open the monitoring URL. The monitoring URL is too slow. Please go and check the pod. So even in this way, I can categorize my namespace. Now let's try to create a namespace, and as you can see, I've run the command kubectl get namespace, and you can see that by default we have 4 namespaces getting created when the Kubernetes cluster is being set up. These namespaces are getting created automatically, initialized automatically. It's not that we create it. So we have default namespace, kube node lease namespace, kube public kube-system. We'll talk about these namespace in a different session. As of now, what I'm going to do is, let me create a new namespace, kubectl create namespace dev. See, in Kubernetes or any other technologies, if you do not know the syntax, and of course we cannot memorize all these commands, so instead what you can do is just use the help option. Okay, so the help option will give you the usage of the command and also the examples for that particular command. Okay, so what we are going to do is we'll say kubectl create namespace dev. So I have created a new namespace called dev. Okay, and now if I describe this namespace, kubectl describe namespace dev. When I describe that, you can see that it says no resource quota and no limit range resource. So by default, whenever we create a namespace, there is no resource quota being allocated and there is no limit range as well. So now let us see what is resource quota and what is limit range. And in real time, whenever we create a namespace, the Kubernetes admin should make sure that we set up the resource quota and limit ranges so that the resources are being properly managed. When I say resources, it's all about CPU, memory, and storage. Okay, and in this we have a minimum and maximum, that is we can make a request and limits. So whenever we go and request for the resources for an application, or whenever we are setting the resource quota for the entire namespace, I can set up a minimum value and a maximum value. Okay, and on the top right you can see that I have referred as M. M refers to millicore. So in Kubernetes, the CPU is being referred as millicore. 1000 millicore is equal to 1 CPU. Okay, so understand resources are nothing but CPU, memory, and storage. These are the resources which we are going to manage and set up a quota for the entire namespace. And as you can see here, when we create a namespace, the first thing is I am creating a resource quota. So what is resource quota? When I say resource quota, I am having two different categories in that. One is I'm setting up the object count and compute resources. Object means all about how many pods we can create in that particular namespace, how many replication controllers we can create, how many services can be created, secrets, persistent volume. Means when I create a dev namespace and give it to a development team, I'm also making sure that I'm setting up a resource quota and saying that, hey team, you can create these many number of pods, replication controllers, services, secrets, and like we are setting up an restrictions for the object count. And then the compute resources means for your entire namespace, I am allocating this much amount of CPU, memory, and storage. So how does a Kubernetes admin decides how much amount of CPU, memory, and storage has to be given? That is totally based on the details what the developer or the team provides. How they are going to utilize this namespace. How many applications are they trying to deploy? What would be the approximate amount of CPU, memory, and storage usage which they might require? At least an approximate amount. Accordingly, we can go and set it. In case, let's say after a few days, the CPU, memory, and storage resources are getting increased, or the object counts are also not sufficient. In that case, the development team can raise a request to the Kubernetes admin, and the Kubernetes admin can increase that. That too is possible. But when we create the namespace, we set up the resource quota with object count and compute resources. And remember, here the compute resources is all about providing the resources for the entire namespace. And the way to run the command would be kubectl create quota. This is a command. Okay, and if I don't know the command syntax, as usual, run --help. I'm just hitting enter. You can see here I have the usage, and here you can see I have create a new resource quota named my quota, and the command says kubectl create quota and the quota name would be my quota. And the syntax starts as hyphen hard equal to CPU equal to 1, memory equal to 1 GB, pods 2, services 3, replication controllers 2, resource quota 1, secrets 5, persistent volume 10. Persistent volume claim as 10. So the values are totally based on the team's requirement and their application usage. We are just going to set up that. Okay. So to run this, I'll just copy this. And just for an example, I'm running only these many. And specifically, I need to mention as -n dev. Means I am setting up the quota for the namespace dev. -n means namespace. If I don't provide this -n dev, what happens is the quota is being set for the default namespace. So by default, if we don't specify the namespace, whatever objects we are creating, those objects are getting created in the default namespace. That is why when I create this quota, I am making sure that I am running this on -n dev namespace. As you can see, the quota got created. To list this, I say kubectl get quota -n dev. And you can see this. I can also describe my namespace, kubectl describe namespace dev. And as you can see, I have the resource quota. Done. Now based on the usage, I mean this is a hard value, this is a limit what we have set. Now based on the team's usage, here I can see how many pods are getting created on all these things. Now one more thing is, now let's say I am assigning, you can have 2 pods created in your namespace, and the developers have created 2 pods. Now they are trying to create the 3rd pod. So now this will throw an error that forbidden. The quota exceeded. That will be the error we'll be facing in line with the object counts. So what happens to the CPU and memory? What if my CPU limit has reached? What if I've used the 1 CPU? At that time, when the 1 CPU is being reached, what happens is your pod gets restarted automatically. Okay, it will try to see after restarting if the pod is getting sufficient CPU to run. If it is still exhausted, it will try to restart few more times. If it is not at all getting fixed, and if it has reached the total usage, then the pod will get into the crash loop back off. At that time, there is no other go, where the developers have to, or the respective team has to reach out to the Kubernetes admin so that they can increase the quota by getting the justification. The other one in the namespace would be limit range. So when resource quota compute resources talks about allocation of CPU, memory and storage for the whole namespace, the limit range talks about the CPU and memory allocation for individual objects, that is for the pod and containers. Okay, so both resource quota and limit ranges in the namespace will make sure that the usage of the resources are being handled properly, and it's not that 1 or 2 pods alone try to consume all the resources. So that's how these resource quota and limit ranges are being done. So if we see the command line, when we do not have a command line as such for limit range the way we have for resource quota, rather we have a YAML. So these YAML can be referred from the Kubernetes website, or even if you go for Red Hat OpenShift, the Red Hat OpenShift documentation also has this. And if you see this, the limit range, we have a kind called limit range, and the limits is being set for the individual pod and individual container at the namespace level. So we are setting up the thing that the maximum CPU memory for a pod, minimum CPU memory for the pod being set, and then similar way for the maximum CPU memory for the container and minimum CPU and memory given for the container. And to execute this, we run the command kubectl create -f limits.yaml -n dev, means Please create the limit range for the namespace dev. Now I can describe again. kubectl describe namespace dev, and we can see that the resource quota and limit ranges are being set. So by this, we are making sure that we have created a namespace for dev, that is for a dev team, and also we have created or set up the resource quota and limit ranges so that the resources like CPU, memory, and storages are being managed properly. So when there is additional requests coming in, when the usage is consumed totally, then we can go and increase as well. So we'll talk about the 4 different default namespaces of Kubernetes in a different session. Thank you all.